Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something a little heavy, but don't worry, we're doing it slowly, gently, and with the emotional volume set very low. So dim the lights, put your phone down face first, and let your brain clock out while history quietly mutters in the background. Tonight we're talking about children born into slavery who, inconveniently for everyone involved, looked white, or at least white enough to make things awkward, which, historically speaking, was never a great position to be in. Now, before we even start, let's get one thing out of the way. Race as a biological concept is nonsense. But race as a social system enforced by laws, violence, paperwork, and vibes? Very real, very strict, and very bad at handling edge cases. And nothing made slave societies more uncomfortable than children who visibly broke the rules they themselves had invented. So let's float back to the Atlantic world, the Americas, roughly the 1600s through the mid-1800s. Plantations, colonies, big houses with columns, men in powdered wigs making extremely confident moral decisions. In most slave societies, especially in British North America and later the United States, status followed the mother. This was called partus sequitur ventrum, which is Latin for, we're going to make this as legally convenient as possible. If your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved. Didn't matter who your father was. Didn't matter if he was white. Didn't matter if he was powerful, wealthy, married, or pretending very hard not to notice you. And yes, that means a lot of these children were fathered by white men, often enslavers themselves, sometimes overseers, sometimes neighbors, sometimes men who would later vote very seriously about morality. Of course they were. This wasn't rare, it was common. So common that entire legal systems quietly rearranged themselves around it. Because if enslaved women could give birth to free children just because the father was white, the whole economic model would start wobbling. And we can't have that. So legally, these children were enslaved. Socially, though, things got complicated. Because some of them had light skin, some had straight hair, some had light eyes. Some looked to a casual observer like any other white child running barefoot in the dirt. And slave societies were obsessed with appearances, absolutely fixated, because the entire system relied on the idea that you could see who was enslaved. And when you couldn't, everyone got nervous. So what actually happened to these children? Well, that depended on a few things: where they were born, who their father was, how obvious the resemblance was, and how much trouble people were willing to tolerate before doing something about it. Let's start with the most common outcome, which is also the least dramatic. Most white-looking enslaved children remained enslaved. They worked, they were sold, they were inherited, they were listed in account books right next to livestock and furniture. With notes: light, nearly white, yellow, high yellow, bright. Slave traders loved these descriptors. They affected price. Light-skinned enslaved people were often valued more highly, not because of any kindness, but because enslavers believed they were better suited for domestic labor. House slaves, maids, valets, cooks. People meant to exist indoors, close to the family, close enough to be watched constantly. Which sounds nicer until you remember that proximity usually meant vulnerability, more surveillance, more expectations, more opportunities for abuse. And yes, sometimes these children were raised in the same household as their white half-siblings, which is one of those historical facts that just sits there quietly, refusing to be processed. Imagine growing up sleeping in the same house as your father, watching him raise his legitimate children, knowing exactly who he is, knowing exactly who you are not allowed to be. And sometimes the resemblance was undeniable. Visitors would notice. Neighbors would whisper. Friends would raise eyebrows and then lower them again very quickly. And the solution was usually silence.
Nobody said anything out loud. Everyone knew. No one acknowledged it. Which is how a lot of history functioned. But sometimes silence wasn't enough. Sometimes these children caused logistical problems. Because if a child looked white enough, they could run away and pass as free. They could travel, they could cross borders, they could disappear. Which was deeply alarming to a system built entirely on control. So some enslavers took preventative measures. They sent children away, sold them south, separated them from family early, out of sight, out of mind. Other times, enslavers did something stranger. They freed them. Manumission wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. Some white fathers freed their mixed-race children out of guilt, or affection, or reputation management, or because the child looked too much like them and it was starting to get weird at dinner parties. Sometimes they freed the mother and child together, sometimes just the child, sometimes with conditions. And here's where things get quietly cruel again. Even when freed, these children were rarely acknowledged publicly as sons or daughters. They were freed as dependents, as wards, as servants, as people who just happened to be around. They might be given education, apprenticeships, small inheritances. Enough to survive, not enough to disrupt anything. Because recognizing them fully would mean admitting things that society was very committed to pretending weren't happening. So they lived in a strange middle space, free but not accepted, white-looking but not white, educated but excluded. And some tried to cross the final line, passing. Passing as white wasn't just about appearance, it was about paperwork, accent, clothing, manners, connections. But appearance mattered. A lot. Light-skinned, formerly enslaved people sometimes moved away, changed names, cut ties, started over. And some succeeded. They married white spouses, raised white children, lived white lives, always with the knowledge that discovery could destroy everything. One accusation, one old acquaintance, one loose document. And the consequences weren't just social. In some places, being revealed as having enslaved ancestry could mean being kidnapped and sold. Yes, sold. Which meant that even freedom was fragile. Now let's drift over to another region for a moment, the Caribbean, places like San Domingue, Jamaica, Barbados. Here, the racial hierarchy had more layers, more categories, more words. Mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, fractions, math, an entire obsession with measuring ancestry like ingredients. And here, white-looking children born enslaved sometimes occupied a slightly different position. In French and Spanish colonies especially, free people of color could own property, run businesses, receive education. Some even owned enslaved people themselves. Which is one of those deeply uncomfortable historical facts we're just going to lay gently on the table and not poke too hard tonight. White-looking children born enslaved might be freed more frequently here, might be trained for skilled labor, might become part of an intermediate class. Still restricted, still watched, still reminded constantly of their place, but closer to something resembling autonomy. And of course, this terrified white elites. Because nothing scares a ruling class like people who don't fit neatly into boxes. And when revolutions happened, like the Haitian Revolution, those fears exploded. Suddenly, ancestry mattered even more. People demanded proof, paper trails, certificates, witnesses. And anyone who looked white but couldn't prove it was suddenly in danger. Which meant that passing could work for decades and then fail overnight. Now, let's bring it back to North America again. Early United States, post-revolution. Freedom rhetoric everywhere. Slavery still very much intact, because, of course it was. White-looking enslaved children continued to exist, and continued to confuse everyone. Courts heard cases where enslaved people sued for freedom based on appearance. I am white. I cannot legally be enslaved. And sometimes, shockingly, they won. Judges would examine skin, hair, facial features, which is exactly as scientific as it sounds. Witnesses testified about family histories, neighbors debated complexions, and freedom could hinge on whether a judge thought you looked enslaved enough. Imagine your entire life reduced to vibes. But winning didn't mean safety. Even free, even legally white, these people often had to leave immediately, start over somewhere else, disappear. Because communities remembered, and memory is dangerous. So as we drift toward the end of this first stretch,
All right, welcome back. If you drifted off a little, that's perfect. History does its best work when you're only half listening. When we left off, we were hovering in that uncomfortable space where law, appearance, and denial all overlapped. So now let's gently slide into the place where enslaved, white-looking children occasionally tried to argue with the system directly. Which means courts. Yes, actual courtrooms with judges and wigs and a very serious belief that you could determine a person's legal status by squinting at them thoughtfully. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, a small but steady number of enslaved people sued for their freedom. These were called freedom suits, and many of them hinged on ancestry. The argument usually went something like this: I am descended from a free white woman, or I am not black, or sometimes just look at me. Which sounds absurd now, but at the time it was considered a valid legal strategy. Judges would call witnesses, neighbors, former owners, people who vaguely remembered someone's grandmother from 30 years ago. Testimony included phrases like, she was very fair, he had straight hair, they did not appear Negro. Again, extremely scientific. And sometimes, miraculously, the court agreed. There are documented cases of enslaved people being declared legally white, not metaphorically, not socially, legally, which meant freedom. But here's the sleepy twist. Freedom was not the end of the story. It was barely the intermission, because being declared white didn't magically insert you into white society. It just removed the most immediate threat. Formerly enslaved people who won these cases were often advised, quietly, to leave town, change names, never bring it up again. Because if public opinion turned, or if someone challenged the ruling, things could unravel very fast. And public opinion loved unraveling things. So imagine winning your freedom by convincing a room of strangers that you look white enough, then spending the rest of your life hoping no one looks too closely. Now, not everyone had access to courts. Freedom suits required money, lawyers, time, and the terrifying experience of challenging your enslaver publicly. So most white-looking enslaved children never tried. Instead, they lived with the constant contradiction of being treated as property while resembling the people who owned them, which produced some deeply strange household dynamics. Let's talk about plantation families for a moment, specifically the children. White children, enslaved children, and the ones who existed awkwardly in between. In many households, enslaved children served as companions to white children, playmates, personal attendants, human accessories. They slept nearby, learned together, sometimes even dressed similarly. And for a few early years the differences were blurred, but eventually adulthood arrived, and with it the rules. White children inherited,
enslaved children were inherited. One gained authority, the other lost even the illusion of it. And when those enslaved children looked white, the transition was especially jarring. Former playmates became masters, former siblings became property, and everyone pretended this was normal. Sometimes white families tried to manage the discomfort by assigning white-looking enslaved children to indoor roles permanently, keeping them close, contained, controlled. Other times, they did the opposite. They sold them. Distance solved a lot of problems. Which brings us to one of the most common fates for these children, being sold away before adolescence, especially girls. Because white-looking enslaved girls were considered valuable in ways we're not going to dwell on too vividly tonight. They were sold young, often to urban households, sometimes far away. Out of sight of the family resemblance, out of sight of the scandal. And if you're sensing a pattern here, yes, the solution was almost always removal. Now let's drift north for a moment. In northern states, gradual emancipation laws created a different kind of confusion. Children born to enslaved mothers might be legally free eventually at 21 or 25 or some other conveniently distant age. Until then, they were bound, indentured, owned in all but name. And white-looking children in these systems sometimes existed in a strange limbo. Free on paper someday, unfree in practice now. Some were apprenticed out, placed in white households, educated just enough to be useful. Others were quietly reclassified, listed as servants, orphans, dependents, which made it easier for everyone to avoid uncomfortable questions. Now let's gently introduce history's favorite coping mechanism, denial. Many white fathers simply did not acknowledge their children, even when resemblance was obvious, even when everyone knew. They paid for schooling indirectly, arranged apprenticeships anonymously, left money in wills through intermediaries, anything but public recognition. Because recognition would require accountability, and that was never the goal. Some men went a step further. They sent their children away to be raised as white, in other towns, by other families, sometimes with the mother's consent, sometimes not. The child would grow up unaware of their origins, or vaguely aware but told never to ask. Which raises an unsettling question. How many white Americans in the 19th century were quietly descended from enslaved people and never knew it? The answer is more than anyone was comfortable admitting. And that discomfort shaped laws, one-drop rules, blood quantum, hyper-specific racial classifications, all designed to close loopholes that real human lives kept opening. Now let's talk about what happened when things went wrong. Because sometimes a white-looking child didn't stay quiet, didn't leave, didn't disappear politely. Sometimes they challenged their status publicly, and that rarely ended well. There are records of enslaved people accused of passing being punished harshly, not because they escaped, but because they blurred boundaries, which was seen as a threat in itself. In some communities, simply claiming whiteness was treated as insubordination, or fraud, or rebellion, because the system depended on everyone knowing their place and staying there. So passing required silence, constant silence, no old friends, no visits home, no slipping up. And even then, it was fragile. All it took was one person saying, "I remember your mother." Which brings us to one of the quietest tragedies in all of this. Family separation wasn't just physical,
It was psychological. White-looking children who passed as white often had to abandon their families completely. Parents, siblings, everyone. No letters, no visits, no funerals, because contact was risk. So freedom came with isolation. And for those who didn't pass, for those who stayed, they lived with constant scrutiny. Too light, too educated, too well-spoken, always watched, always suspected. And that suspicion followed them everywhere. So, as we drift toward the end of part 2, let's just acknowledge something quietly. These children were never allowed to simply exist. Every aspect of their lives was interpreted, explained, justified. They weren't seen as people, they were seen as problems to be managed, and management rarely involved kindness. Next time, we'll slide into specific individual stories, people whose names survived, whose lives were documented just enough to give us a glimpse. Not heroes, not villains, just people navigating a system that refused to make sense. So settle back in, let the words blur a little.
All right, welcome back again. If part 2 felt a little paperwork heavy, that was intentional. Nothing puts you to sleep like bureaucracy quietly ruining lives. Now, for part 3, we're going to slow things down even more. Fewer systems, more people. Because once you attach names to these stories, everything becomes softer and heavier at the same time. Still calm, still gentle, just a little more personal. Let's start with someone historians actually know quite a bit about. Her name was Sally Hemings. Yes, that Sally Hemings. Born in Virginia in 1773, enslaved, light-skinned, very light-skinned. Her mother, Elizabeth Hemings, was herself the daughter of an enslaved African woman and an English sea captain, which already tells you how far back this pattern went. By the time Sally Hemings was born, she was legally 3/4 European by ancestry, and she looked it. She had straight hair, light skin, features that white visitors noticed immediately. And she was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. Yes, that Thomas Jefferson, author of All Men Are Created Equal, because of course it was him. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's wife's half-sister, same father, different legal status, which is one of those facts that just sits there quietly until you notice it, and then it never stops being strange. Sally Hemings had children with Jefferson, multiple children, and those children looked white. Very white. So white, in fact, that several of them eventually passed into white society completely. Jefferson freed all of Sally Hemings' surviving children, some during his lifetime, some in his will. But here's the important part. They were freed quietly. No announcements, no public acknowledgement. 2 of her sons, Madison and Eston Hemings, eventually left Virginia and began new lives as white men, changed names, moved north. Eston became Eston Jefferson, a white musician, a husband, a father. His children grew up white, married white, never enslaved. And just like that, a family line crossed an invisible boundary. But Sally Hemings herself, she was never formally freed. She lived out her life in quiet, unofficial freedom, never acknowledged publicly, never compensated, never recognized as anything more than a footnote for a very long time. Which is how these stories often go. The children sometimes slipped through, the mothers almost never did. Now let's gently float away from famous names for a moment. Because for every Sally Hemings, there were thousands of children whose names didn't survive. Only descriptions. Light boy, age 10. Mulatto girl, very fair. Yellow child. These lists appear in bills of sale, wills, estate inventories.
Not diaries, not letters, just lists. And those lists tell us something quietly devastating. White-looking enslaved children were everywhere. They were normal. They were expected. Which means this wasn't scandalous behavior. It was routine. Now let's talk about girls specifically, just briefly, very gently. White-looking enslaved girls were often trained for domestic service early, household labor, personal attendance. They learned to read rooms, anticipate moods, disappear when needed. They were praised for being refined, quiet, pretty. Words that sound nice until you realize what they meant. They were kept close to white families, close enough to be controlled, close enough to be monitored. And when they reached adolescence, their lives often narrowed rather than expanded. Marriage was rarely an option. Stability was rare. Protection depended entirely on the whims of others. Some were freed, some were sold, some remained trapped in households where they looked uncomfortably like the family members they served. And if that resemblance became too obvious, they were moved. Distance was always the solution. Now let's shift to boys. White-looking enslaved boys were sometimes apprenticed, trained as craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, tailors, skills that made them valuable, portable, easier to sell. Some were allowed to hire themselves out, earn wages, keep a small portion, which looked a lot like autonomy, but wasn't, because their bodies were still owned, their movement still controlled, and passing as white was always a risk calculation. Too bold, and you were punished. Too cautious, and you stayed trapped. Now let's talk about the moment everything changed. Emancipation. Mid-1800s, the Civil War. Legal slavery ends. And you might think, finally, this is where things get easier. They didn't. White-looking, formerly enslaved children, now adults, entered a society obsessed with sorting people. Freedmen's bureaus, registrations, census records. Everyone suddenly needed to be categorized again. And for people who existed in between, this was dangerous. Some were registered as black, some as mulatto, some as white, sometimes inconsistently. A person might appear as white in one census, black in the next, mulatto in another, not because they changed, but because perception did, which affected where they could live, who they could marry, what work they could do. And some made a choice. They crossed the line permanently, moved west, moved north, changed names, never went back. Passing after emancipation wasn't just about escaping slavery, it was about escaping racism, and many succeeded, which means that entire white communities quietly absorbed people of enslaved ancestry without knowing, without asking. And that terrified white supremacists, which is why racial laws tightened in the late 19th century, not loosened. One-drop rules became common, paper trails became more important, because ambiguity had proven too dangerous. Now let's pause here for a soft, uncomfortable realization. A lot of modern Americans, especially white Americans, are descended from enslaved people and don't know it, not metaphorically, literally. Because passing worked, because records were destroyed, because families stayed silent, and history for a long time cooperated with that silence. Which brings us back to the children themselves. What happened to them emotionally? We don't have diaries, we don't have confessions, but we can infer. They lived with constant self-monitoring, constant calculation. What can I say? Where can I go? Who can I trust? Identity wasn't something they explored, it was something they managed. And management is exhausting. So as we drift toward the end of Part 3, let's keep things quiet. These weren't exceptional people. They weren't famous for most of history. They weren't celebrated. They were ordinary children born into an extraordinary contradiction. Too white for slavery, too enslaved for whiteness. And that tension shaped entire legal systems, even if those systems never admitted it. In the next part, we'll gently explore what happened when these contradictions finally broke open, when society tried and failed to enforce clear lines. So stay still, let your thoughts wander. History will keep talking either way.
All right. Welcome back. If you've made it this far without falling asleep, congratulations. But also, maybe blink a little slower. We're settling in for a long, quiet stretch now. In the last part, we talked about people who slipped through the cracks, who passed, who vanished into new lives, who carried silence like a survival skill. Now, we're going to talk about what happened when society noticed that those cracks existed at all. Because eventually, ambiguity becomes inconvenient. And when ambiguity threatens power, power reacts. So let's drift into the late 1800s, post-Civil War, post-emancipation, a time when slavery was gone, but the anxiety absolutely was not. Formerly enslaved people were free, on paper, in theory. And suddenly, millions of people who had been legally categorized as property were now supposed to exist as citizens. Which raised a deeply uncomfortable question for white America. How do you enforce racial hierarchy when you can't legally own people anymore? The answer, as it turns out, was paperwork, and fear, and extremely aggressive classification. Because if slavery had taught elites anything, it was this: blurred boundaries are dangerous. And white-looking formerly enslaved people were the blurriest boundary of all. So the response was tightening. Let's talk about the census. Early U.S. censuses were casual about race. Vague, inconsistent. Someone could be listed as white in one decade, mulatto in the next, black in another. Not because they changed, but because the person holding the clipboard had a different opinion that day. And opinions mattered. But after emancipation, those opinions started carrying consequences. Voting rights, property ownership, marriage legality, school access, all tied to race, which meant race suddenly had to be defined very clearly, or at least aggressively. So states began passing laws that narrowed definitions. Negro came to include anyone with any African ancestry, no matter how distant, no matter how invisible. This is where the infamous one-drop rule solidified. And it didn't come from science, or logic, or reality. It came from fear. Fear that too many people had already crossed over. Fear that whiteness wasn't as pure or exclusive as advertised. Fear that the line had already been breached. And once that fear set in, society doubled down. Hard. Now let's slow this down and think about what this meant for white-looking people of enslaved descent. Before, ambiguity sometimes worked in their favor. Passing was possible. Fluidity existed. After, ambiguity became suspicious. If you looked white but didn't have the right background, questions followed. If your paperwork was incomplete, people noticed. If your family history was unclear, that was a problem. And many families' histories were unclear, because slavery doesn't generate neat genealogies. Which meant that suddenly ancestry mattered more than appearance. And ancestry was something you could be accused of. Not proven, accused. So communities began policing each other. Neighbors whispered. Relatives argued. Enemies made claims. She's not really white. He has black blood.
I heard his grandmother was. And sometimes that was enough. Court cases exploded. People sued to be recognized as white, or sued others to be classified as black. Entire trials revolved around appearance, rumors, family trees, and vibes. Again, very scientific. Judges examined ears, noses, hair texture. Witnesses testified about who someone associated with, where they lived, how they spoke. Race became a performance you could fail. And white-looking people of enslaved descent lived under constant threat of exposure, which meant many made a choice. They disappeared, moved west, moved to cities, moved somewhere no one knew their name, and they never looked back. Which is why by the early 20th century, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of Americans had quietly crossed racial lines, and society knew it, which made it angrier. So let's talk about Jim Crow for a moment. Calmly, gently. Jim Crow laws weren't just about segregation. They were about surveillance, about making sure everyone stayed where they were supposed to be. And white-looking black Americans posed a unique problem. They could sit in the wrong train car, attend the wrong school, marry the wrong person. And that terrified lawmakers. So laws became harsher. Anti-miscegenation laws tightened. Marriage licenses required proof. Birth certificates became more detailed. And still, people slipped through. Which meant enforcement got personal. Communities took matters into their own hands. And this is where things became especially dangerous. Because if someone was suspected of passing, violence wasn't far behind. Not always physical, often social. Jobs lost, homes burned, families ostracized, sometimes worse. And because passing depended on silence, defending yourself often meant revealing everything, which defeated the purpose. So many endured quietly. Now let's pause here for a quiet realization. Passing wasn't betrayal. It wasn't deception. It was survival. It was choosing safety over honesty, stability over connection, silence over risk. And it came at a cost. People who passed as white often lived with permanent anxiety, permanent disconnection. They couldn't attend family funerals, couldn't acknowledge parents, couldn't grieve publicly. They lived with a constant internal edit. What can I say? What must I never say? And they carried that tension into old age. Some confessed on deathbeds. Some never did. Which brings us to a strange modern consequence. DNA testing. Yes, that thing everyone does for fun now. For a lot of white families, DNA tests have revealed African ancestry that makes no sense until you understand passing. Suddenly, a secret isn't a secret anymore, and families are forced to confront histories that were buried deliberately. Not out of shame, but out of fear. Now let's zoom out just a little bit. What happened to the children born to enslaved people who looked white? Some became enslaved adults. Some became free people of color. Some became white Americans. Some lived quietly. Some vanished. Some left descendants who would never know their story. There is no single ending. And that's the point. History likes categories. Life doesn't. And these children existed at the fault line between the two. They exposed the lie at the heart of racial hierarchy, that it was natural, that it was obvious, that it was stable. It wasn't. It had to be enforced, constantly, aggressively. And the more it was enforced, the more cracks appeared. So as we ease toward the end of this very long, very quiet story, let's sit with one final thought. These children didn't change history by rebelling, or leading movements, or writing manifestos. They changed history simply by existing, by being undeniable evidence that the system didn't make sense. And systems really hate that. So if you're drifting off now, that's okay. That's kind of the point. History isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a low hum of unresolved tension carried through generations. Thanks for listening. Rest well.
All right. Welcome back one last time. Or maybe not the last time. History has a way of refusing to wrap things up neatly. But for tonight, this is where we let the story stretch out, flatten a little, and slowly dissolve into the background. So get comfortable again. Shift your pillow. Unclench your jaw. We're drifting into the afterlife of all this. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. Because by the early 20th century, the children we've been talking about were mostly gone. They'd grown up, they'd aged, they'd died. But the choices they made kept working long after they were buried. Let's start with a simple reality. Passing worked. Not always, not safely, not without cost, but enough of the time that it changed the demographic reality of entire countries. By the 1920s and 1930s, sociologists were already quietly aware that race statistics didn't add up. Too many people categorized as white had undocumented ancestry. Too many families had stories that stopped abruptly around the mid-1800s. And no one pushed too hard, because asking questions threatened too many people. So silence became inherited. White families passed down traditions without origins, last names without explanations, grandparents who refused to talk about childhood, photographs that disappeared. And when children asked, they were told things like, "Oh, she was just very dark. He was adopted. It's complicated," which is history's favorite answer. Now let's slow down and sit with the emotional consequences. People who passed didn't just change their race on paper, they changed how they remembered themselves. They edited their own pasts. A formerly enslaved woman who passed as white might never speak her mother's name again. A man who grew up enslaved might invent an entirely new childhood. Not because they wanted to lie, but because telling the truth was dangerous. And over time, invented stories become memories. Children grow up believing them. Grandchildren repeat them, and eventually the truth doesn't feel real anymore. It feels hypothetical. Which means that when the truth finally resurfaces, it feels disruptive rather than clarifying. Now let's talk about how white America processed this. Very slowly and mostly incorrectly. In the early 20th century, race science exploded. Phrenology, eugenics, blood measurements, charts, graphs. An entire industry devoted to proving something everyone was already anxious about: that whiteness was fragile. And the more scientists tried to define it, the more absurd the definitions became. Someone could be white in one state and black in another, white before marriage, black after. Entire families were reclassified overnight. And white-looking people with enslaved ancestry were often caught in the middle of these shifts, sometimes stripped of whiteness retroactively, sometimes protected by local reputation, sometimes exposed deliberately by enemies. Which tells us something important. Race was never about appearance alone. It was about power. And power does not like ambiguity. Now let's drift into the middle of the 20th century. World wars, industrialization,
urbanization. People moved. A lot. And movement helped passing more than anything else ever had. Cities swallowed anonymity whole. Factories didn't ask about grandparents. Apartment buildings didn't care. And suddenly, people who might never have passed in a small town could do so easily. So they did. By the thousands. Which means that by the 1950s, passing was no longer exceptional. It was just unrecorded. And the civil rights movement complicated everything, because now race was political again, public, visible. And some people who had passed as white quietly supported civil rights from a distance. Others avoided it entirely, because visibility was risk. And some, very few, stepped forward and reclaimed black identity publicly, which was rare and brave, and often met with suspicion from both sides, because once you leave a category, society doesn't like letting you back in. Now let's talk about something uncomfortable but necessary. Not everyone who passed did so reluctantly. Some embraced whiteness fully, adopted its prejudices, distanced themselves aggressively from black communities, not because they were cruel by nature, but because fear makes people defensive. And sometimes survival requires convincing yourself that you belong, which leads to one of the strangest legacies of all this. White supremacy was reinforced not only by people born white, but also by people who had escaped racial violence and never wanted to risk falling back into it. That's not an accusation, it's an observation. Systems reproduce themselves in quiet ways. Now let's move closer to the present. Late 20th century, early 21st century. DNA testing becomes affordable, casual, fun. People do it for entertainment. And suddenly, family myths start collapsing. A white family gets a result, 12% West African, and no one knows what to do with that. Grandparents panic. Parents argue. Stories resurface. Someone remembers a great aunt who disappeared. Someone else remembers a relative who looked different. And the silence breaks. But gently. Because even now, talking about this can feel destabilizing. It challenges identity, belonging, assumptions. And it forces people to confront something deeply uncomfortable, that their families benefited from systems they don't fully understand, or suffered under systems they were never told about. So let's circle back to the children themselves, the ones at the center of this story. What happened to them? They grew old. They carried secrets. They made compromises. Some lived peaceful lives. Some lived anxious ones. Some never spoke their truth. Some whispered it to one trusted person, and many took it to the grave, not out of shame, but out of habit. Silence had kept them alive once. Why stop now? Which brings us to the quiet conclusion of all this. These children didn't just exist between categories. They revealed that the categories were artificial. They exposed the machinery behind race, the laws, the enforcement, the constant adjustment. And society responded by pretending harder, by insisting louder, by simplifying narratives. But history remembers. Not loudly, not cleanly, in fragments, in footnotes, in DNA percentages, in family stories that don't quite line up. So as we let this story finally settle, here's the softest possible ending. If you are descended from enslaved people and don't know it, that doesn't make you dishonest. It makes you part of a long tradition of survival. And if you are descended from people who passed, that doesn't erase where they came from. It explains why they stayed quiet. History isn't just what happened, it's what people felt safe enough to say.
And for a very long time, silence was the safest option. So, if you're drifting off now, let that be the final note. A low hum, a quiet inheritance. Thanks for listening. Sleep well.
All right. Welcome back again. If this feels like it should have ended already, that's understandable. History often feels that way, like it should wrap up politely, say goodnight, and leave the room. But it doesn't. It lingers. It sits at the edge of the bed and occasionally clears its throat. So for part 6, we're going even wider than before. Less about individual choices, more about what those choices quietly built over time. Because by now, the children we started with, the ones born to enslaved people who looked white, are long gone. But the world they helped shape is still very much awake. Let's begin with something deceptively simple. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is storage. When people don't talk about something for generations, it doesn't disappear. It settles, it compresses, it turns into instinct. And passing created a lot of stored silence. Entire families learned, without ever saying it out loud, that certain questions were unsafe. Certain stories were incomplete on purpose. Certain topics made elders suddenly tired. Children learned when not to ask. Teenagers learned when to drop a subject. Adults learned how to redirect conversations smoothly. And eventually, no one remembered why. They just knew. Now let's widen the lens even more. By the mid-20th century, race in America had become both rigid and strangely abstract. Legally, lines were firm. Socially, they were enforced. Culturally, they were mythologized. But underneath all of that, the population itself was complicated. People married across lines quietly. People passed unintentionally. People lived entire lives categorized one way while biologically connected to another. And institutions adjusted without admitting it. Schools quietly accepted students who looked right. Neighborhoods absorbed families who blended in. Employers didn't ask too many questions if no one made them uncomfortable. Which tells us something important. The system wasn't actually interested in truth. It was interested in stability. As long as things looked orderly, the machinery kept running. And the descendants of enslaved people who looked white became part of that machinery, not by choice, but by inertia. Now, let's talk about memory. Collective memory is not the same as historical fact. It's curated, edited, smoothed out. And passing forced memory to become selective. Black history, as it was taught, became cleaner, more dramatic, easier to separate. White history became purer, straighter, more flattering. And the messy overlap, the place where these children lived, was quietly erased. Because overlap complicates stories, and nations prefer simple ones. Now let's slow down and think about how this shaped identity in ways people rarely notice. In many families affected by passing, there's a subtle anxiety around belonging, a sense of being slightly out of place, of not quite matching expectations. People describe it as restlessness or rootlessness or just feeling off. And they never connect it to history, because how could they? The story was never told. So instead, it becomes personality, or temperament, or coincidence. But history doesn't disappear just because it's unnamed. Now let's talk about guilt. Quiet guilt. Some descendants of people who passed eventually learned the truth, sometimes late in life, sometimes by accident. And the reaction wasn't always relief. Often it was confusion, shame, disorientation. Questions like, did my family betray someone? Did we benefit unfairly? Do I belong anywhere now? And there are no clean answers, because passing wasn't theft, it was escape. But escape has consequences for the people left behind, and that tension between survival and loss doesn't resolve neatly.
It just sits there. Now let's widen things even further. This phenomenon wasn't limited to the United States. Brazil, the Caribbean, South Africa, colonial Latin America. Anywhere slavery existed alongside rigid racial hierarchies, this happened. Children born into categories that didn't match their faces. Societies inventing increasingly elaborate systems to explain it away. And everywhere, the same pattern appears. When reality doesn't match ideology, ideology tightens. It doesn't loosen. Which is why modern discussions of race can feel strangely intense. They're not just about the present, they're about centuries of unresolved contradiction. Now, let's gently address something modern audiences struggle with, the idea that ancestry equals identity. For the children we've been discussing, ancestry was danger, identity was strategy. They didn't have the luxury of alignment. So when modern conversations demand clarity, claim this, own that, declare yourself, it can feel jarring to families shaped by passing. Because survival once depended on not declaring, and those instincts don't disappear overnight. They echo. Now let's come back to education. For a long time, textbooks avoided these stories, not accidentally, deliberately, because acknowledging white-looking enslaved children meant admitting sexual violence, coercion, hypocrisy, and complicity. It meant admitting that slavery was intimate, domestic, personal, not just plantations and whips, but bedrooms and children and inheritance disputes. And that's harder to narrate calmly. So history stayed abstract. But abstraction never really works forever. Eventually, people notice gaps. Why does this family tree stop here? Why does this photo disappear? Why does this surname change? And slowly, questions return. Now let's talk about the internet for a moment. The internet did something unusual. It connected fragments. People shared stories, posted documents, compared DNA results, and suddenly individual silences started forming patterns. Not accusations, not scandals, just recognition. Oh, this happened to you too? And that collective realization is still unfolding, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Now let's circle back to the original children one last time. They didn't choose to be symbols. They didn't choose to destabilize racial categories. They were born into a system that demanded clarity from bodies that refused to provide it. And in doing so, they revealed something fundamental. Race had to be enforced because it wasn't natural. It had to be explained because it wasn't obvious. It had to be protected because it wasn't stable. And every time a child looked wrong, the system panicked just a little. So it tightened laws, invented categories, redefined words, all to avoid admitting the truth, that humanity doesn't sort cleanly. So, as we let Part 6 gently wind down, let's end with something very quiet. If this story feels unresolved, that's because it is. There is no final reveal, no justice scene, no clean reconciliation, just layers of adaptation, layers of silence, layers of memory. And maybe that's the most historically accurate ending of all. History doesn't resolve, it accumulates. So if you're drifting now, half awake, half asleep, let that be enough. A story doesn't need your attention anymore. It's already part of the background hum. Good night.
All right. Welcome back. Yes, we're still here. And yes, we're still going. If Part 6 felt wide, slow, and a little abstract, that was on purpose. Tonight, we stretch even further, not upward, outward. Because at some point, this story stops belonging only to the children born to enslaved people who looked white. It becomes a story about everyone who inherited the world they quietly helped shape. So get comfortable again. Let your thoughts drift. We're not arriving anywhere dramatic. We're just letting the echo finish traveling. Let's begin with something very simple and very unsettling. Most people believe their family history is complete. Not perfect, not flattering, but complete. They assume that whatever happened, someone would have mentioned it, written it down, left a record. But silence is also a record, just not one we're trained to read. The children we've been talking about lived in a time when silence was functional, protective, necessary. And when a behavior keeps you alive long enough, it doesn't disappear when the danger fades. It becomes tradition, habit, atmosphere. That's how silence survives emancipation, survives Jim Crow, survives civil rights, survives even good intentions. Because by then, it's no longer about fear of punishment, it's about fear of disruption. Now let's talk about inheritance, but not money. Emotional inheritance. Families pass down more than names and recipes. They pass down instincts. What topics feel heavy? What questions feel rude? What stories get redirected halfway through? Children absorb this without being taught. They learn which grandparents answer questions and which ones suddenly need a nap. They learn which photos are framed and which ones never make it out of boxes. And because this learning happens quietly, it feels natural, like personality, like temperament, not like history. So when people say, "My family just isn't very emotional," or "we don't really talk about the past," what they're often describing is survival behavior fossilized into tradition. Now let's step back and look at society as a whole. Modern racial categories feel ancient, permanent, obvious, but they're not. They're recent, engineered, continuously adjusted. And the existence of white-looking children born into slavery forced those adjustments repeatedly. Every time one appeared, the system had to answer a question it hated. Is race about blood, appearance, behavior, documentation? And because none of those answers worked consistently, the system responded the only way it knew how, by making the rules stricter. That's why racial definitions didn't loosen after slavery ended. They hardened. That's why one-drop rules emerged when passing became common. That's why paperwork multiplied when bodies became unreliable. So when modern people ask why race still feels so rigid, the answer isn't tradition, it's panic, a long memory of losing control. Now let's talk about modern identity debates, but gently. Today, people are often asked to define themselves clearly, choose boxes, claim labels. And for many descendants of people who passed or tried to, this feels strangely uncomfortable. Not because they reject identity, but because clarity once carried consequences. When your family history includes people who survived by being unreadable, ambiguity doesn't feel like confusion, it feels like safety. So when society pushes for declarations, some people hesitate, not out of bad faith, but out of inherited instinct. Now let's slow down and consider how this shapes empathy. If you grow up in a family shaped by silence, you may struggle to articulate pain, or name injustice, or even recognize it when it's subtle. Because historically, subtlety was where danger lived. So people learned to smooth things over, downplay discomfort, avoid confrontation. And that doesn't make them apathetic, it makes them adapted. Now let's talk about archives. Historians love archives, records, documents. But archives reflect power. People who were enslaved rarely controlled how they were recorded, and people who passed often erased themselves deliberately. So the archive is full of gaps.
Not because nothing happened, but because something happened that couldn't be written down safely. Which means that absence is not neutrality, it's evidence of pressure. So when historians say, we don't have enough documentation, what they often mean is people had excellent reasons not to leave one. Now let's drift into something modern again. Public reactions to discovering enslaved ancestry. For some people, it feels grounding, clarifying, like finally finding a missing piece. For others, it feels destabilizing, like the floor shifting slightly under their identity. And both reactions are valid. Because learning that your family history includes people who passed forces you to confront uncomfortable truths. That race is not fixed, that privilege can be inherited accidentally, that suffering can be hidden successfully. And that discomfort often leads people to ask the wrong question. Was this wrong? Which assumes moral clarity where none existed. The better question is, what conditions made this necessary? Because passing wasn't a failure of integrity, it was a response to violence, and judging it from a safe distance misses the point. Now let's widen the lens one last time. The children born to enslaved people who looked white did not intend to destabilize racial systems. They were not activists, they were not symbols, they were simply present. And presence in a system built on absolutes is disruptive. Their existence forced laws to be written, courts to argue, communities to police. They made racism work harder. And when a system has to work hard to maintain itself, it reveals its weakness. Now let's think about the quiet irony of it all. The system that insisted race was obvious spent centuries explaining why it wasn't. The society that claimed purity obsessed endlessly over contamination. The culture that demanded clear boundaries kept producing people who crossed them. And every time, instead of questioning the premise, it reinforced the structure. Which is why these stories matter, not because they're shocking, but because they're clarifying. They show us how much effort inequality requires. Now let's gently move toward an ending, not a conclusion, but a settling. If you are alive today, you are living among the consequences of these choices. In naming conventions, neighborhood patterns, family silences, cultural anxieties. Not as guilt, not as blame, as inheritance. And inheritance is not something you choose, it's something you notice. And noticing is the beginning of understanding. So if this story leaves you with more questions than answers, that's appropriate. It was never meant to resolve. The children we began with did not get clean endings, they got workable ones. And those workable endings multiplied into families, into towns, into nations. So now, as the words slow down and your thoughts drift sideways, let's leave it here. Not with a lesson, not with a moral, just with awareness. That history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hums. Sometimes it lives quietly in the things no one thought to explain. And if you're falling asleep now, that's okay. The story isn't going anywhere. It's already woven in. Good night.
All right. Welcome back. Yes, we're still moving. Slowly, gently. Like history pacing around a dark room, not quite ready to sit down. If Part 7 felt like the story had quietly turned its chair toward the present, Part 8 is where it settles into the room with us. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, just there. Because by now, this is no longer a story about past children, past laws, or past silences.
It's about how those silences became background noise, and how background noise is the hardest thing to notice. Let's start with something small. Think about how often people say, "We just don't know much about that side of the family." It sounds neutral, harmless, even normal. But historically, not knowing was rarely accidental. For families shaped by passing, forgetting was active, intentional, necessary. Names were dropped, places were avoided, photographs were never labeled, stories were shortened until they lost context, and eventually the absence itself felt ordinary, like static you don't notice until it stops. Now let's widen this idea just a little. Entire communities learned how not to know. White neighborhoods absorbed families who fit visually. Schools welcomed children who blended in. Churches accepted congregants who didn't raise questions. And nobody asked where they came from. Not because curiosity didn't exist, but because curiosity threatened comfort. And comfort is powerful. So the system didn't collapse under ambiguity. It adapted. It learned to coexist with contradiction as long as the contradiction stayed quiet. Now let's talk about generational distance. When the original danger fades, the reason for silence fades with it, but the habit remains. Children inherit rules without explanations. Don't ask, don't say, don't correct. And those rules become emotional reflexes. People feel discomfort without knowing why, defensiveness without a clear trigger, a vague sense that certain conversations are risky, which can look like denial from the outside, or avoidance, or indifference, but often it's just inherited caution. Now let's think about how this shaped public narratives. For a long time, slavery was discussed as a system that happened over there, on plantations, in fields, at a distance. But the existence of white-looking enslaved children complicated that story. It implied intimacy, domesticity, family-level entanglement, which made the story harder to tell cleanly. So it was softened, abstracted. Slavery became economics, politics, regional conflict, not bedrooms, not children, not inheritance disputes over people who looked like family. And because of that, modern audiences often feel surprised when confronted with these stories, not because they're rare, but because they were edited out. Now let's talk about why that editing still matters. When a society avoids acknowledging how deeply intertwined its hierarchies were, it struggles to understand why inequality persists. People ask, why does this still matter? Why can't we just move on? But you can't move on from something that was never fully integrated into the story. Unprocessed history doesn't disappear. It becomes structure. Now let's gently return to the idea of identity again. For descendants of passing, identity can feel oddly provisional, like something that works but could be questioned, something that fits but not perfectly. And that feeling doesn't always express itself as racial anxiety. Sometimes it shows up as overachievement, or people-pleasing, or a need to belong very convincingly. Because historically, belonging was conditional, and conditions linger. Now let's step into the present moment more fully. We live in a time obsessed with visibility, with telling stories, with uncovering hidden histories, which is good, necessary. But it can also clash with families whose survival depended on being unseen. So, when people hesitate to engage, it's easy to misinterpret that hesitation as resistance. But sometimes it's just unfamiliarity with openness, a muscle that was never safe to use. Now let's talk about reconciliation, but quietly. Reconciliation is often imagined as confession followed by relief. But for families shaped by passing, Confession can feel destabilizing because it doesn't just reveal facts, it rearranges relationships. It changes how people see themselves and how they're seen. And that kind of change doesn't happen cleanly. It happens slowly, awkwardly, with long pauses, which is why many families sit in a middle space, aware enough to suspect, not ready enough to ask, and that limbo can last generations. Now let's widen the lens again. This phenomenon of people existing between categories and forcing systems to adapt did not end with slavery. It repeats with immigrants, with class, with language, with gender. Every time a system claims clarity, reality introduces blur, and the response is always the same. Rules tighten, definitions sharpen, enforcement increases, until eventually the system has to acknowledge that blur is permanent, and then it pretends it always knew. Now let's circle back to the original children one last time, but differently, not as historical subjects, as teachers, not because they intended to teach anything, but because their lives demonstrate something quietly important, that identity is negotiated, not discovered, that belonging is granted, not inherent, and that systems survive by pretending flexibility is fairness, and survival often requires compromise that looks confusing in hindsight. Now let's slow the pace even more. If you're listening to this late at night, half asleep, there's something appropriate about that, because these histories don't announce themselves. They seep in, through family habits, through discomfort, through things that feel personal but aren't. And noticing them doesn't require confrontation, just attention. Now let's gently address the idea of responsibility. Understanding this history doesn't assign blame, it assigns context. It explains why certain conversations feel charged, why certain topics feel exhausting, why some people react strongly to ambiguity, because ambiguity once carried stakes, and memory doesn't always distinguish between past and present danger. Now let's drift toward a soft landing. If Part 8 feels like it's saying less while meaning more, that's intentional. By now, the facts are in. The events have happened. The patterns are clear. What remains is atmosphere, the feeling of living inside inherited structures you didn't build. And that feeling is subtle. It's background noise, which brings us to the quietest conclusion yet. History doesn't only live in dates and documents. It lives in reflexes, in silences, in what feels normal. And the children born to enslaved people who looked white didn't just expose a system's contradictions. They helped create a world where contradiction could be ignored as long as it behaved. And we are still living inside that arrangement. So, if you're drifting now, thoughts blurring, words softening, that's okay. This story was never meant to end sharply. It fades, like background noise you only notice when it's gone. Good night.
All right. Welcome back. Yes, we're still here. And yes, this is still unfolding. If Part 8 felt like history had finally melted into atmosphere, Part 9 is where we let that atmosphere linger. Not to explain anything new, not to resolve anything old, just to sit with the way unfinished stories keep operating long after everyone involved is gone. Because history doesn't stop when narration does. It keeps working quietly, whether we pay attention or not. Let's begin with something almost boring. Routine. Most of what survives from the past survives because it became routine, something people stopped questioning. For families shaped by passing, routine was safety. You don't talk about certain things. You don't ask certain questions.
You don't volunteer unnecessary information. At first, this is a strategy. Then it becomes etiquette. Then it becomes personality. And eventually, no one remembers why it started. They just know that this is how things are done. Now let's think about how this plays out over generations. A child grows up in a family where some topics are gently redirected. Nothing dramatic, no arguments, just a subtle shift in tone. The child learns. They internalize the map. By the time they're an adult, they don't experience this as restriction. They experience it as intuition. I just don't feel like going there. It's not really relevant. It doesn't matter. And history nods quietly from the corner, because that's exactly how it likes to stay hidden. Now let's talk about the difference between forgetting and erasure. Forgetting is passive. Erasure is active. Passing required erasure. Not necessarily malicious, not necessarily permanent, but deliberate. Names were changed, birthplaces simplified, timelines adjusted. A person might remove 1 year from a story, 1 town from a memory, 1 relative from a photograph. And once that edit is made, everything else has to align around it. So more edits follow, until the story feels smooth again. And smooth stories are comforting. Now let's widen the lens again, because this didn't just happen in private homes. Institutions learned these habits too. Schools taught simplified histories. Churches avoided uncomfortable specifics. Local histories celebrated founders without examining families. Not because the truth was unknown, but because it was inconvenient. And inconvenience, historically, is one of the strongest forces shaping memory. Now let's pause on something subtle. Modern people often imagine that uncovering hidden history will feel like revelation, like clarity, like relief. But often, it feels like disorientation. Because hidden histories don't just add information, they rearrange meaning. Suddenly, family dynamics make sense in a way that's unsettling. Suddenly, inherited anxieties have context. Suddenly, things that felt personal reveal themselves as historical. And that can feel destabilizing. Which is why some people resist these stories, not out of hostility, but out of exhaustion. Now let's talk about timing. History has a rhythm. Some stories surface when society is ready to hear them, others wait. The stories of white-looking children born to enslaved people waited a long time. Not because they weren't important, but because they disrupted too many narratives at once. They challenged ideas of purity, of morality, of distance. They forced societies to admit that slavery wasn't just violence inflicted outward, it was intimacy managed inward. And intimacy is harder to condemn cleanly. So the stories stayed quiet. Until they didn't.
All right. Welcome back. Yes, we're still here. And if you're wondering how this story can possibly keep going, that's actually part of the point. Because this isn't a story that ends. It's one that thins out. It stretches. It becomes atmosphere. So for part 10, we're going to do something very simple and very difficult. We're going to stay. No new revelations, no new villains, no big historical milestones. Just the long, quiet aftermath of everything we've already talked about. Because that's where most people actually live. Let's begin with a thought that feels obvious once you sit with it. History doesn't stop influencing people when it stops being discussed. It stops influencing people when it stops being felt. And the history of passing, of white-looking children born into slavery, never stopped being felt. It just lost its words. So instead of stories, it turned into moods. Instead of explanations, it turned into instincts. Families didn't pass down details, they passed down tone. Now let's slow down and look at that more closely. Tone is subtle. It's the pause before an answer, the slight tightening when certain topics come up, the casual, "oh, that was a long time ago," that shuts a conversation down gently. Children grow up reading tone long before they understand content. They know which questions land softly and which ones don't. They know when curiosity is welcome and when it's tolerated. They know which stories are repeated and which ones trail off halfway through. And they don't need to know why. They just need to know how to behave. That's how history survives without names. Now let's think about how this plays out emotionally. Many descendants of families shaped by passing describe a strange contradiction. They feel secure and unsettled, rooted and disconnected, confident and oddly cautious. And they often assume this is just personality. But personality doesn't appear in a vacuum. It forms in environments, in atmospheres, in unspoken rules. And families shaped by racial ambiguity learned to prize stability above all else. Don't rock the boat. Don't stand out unnecessarily. Don't volunteer information that could be misunderstood, which, over generations, becomes a worldview. Now let's widen the frame again. Societies are just families scaled up. They develop shared instincts, shared avoidances, shared blind spots. And the presence of white-looking enslaved children created one of the biggest blind spots of all, because their existence exposed a truth that societies were not prepared to integrate, that race was not self-evident, that hierarchy required constant maintenance, that intimacy and violence were entangled. So, rather than absorb that truth, societies learned to step around it, carefully, repeatedly, until stepping around it felt natural. Now let's talk about how this shows up today, quietly, in discomfort around discussions of ancestry, in resistance to complexity, in the desire for clean categories and clear labels. These reactions don't come from nowhere. They come from centuries of managing contradiction by simplifying it. So, when modern conversations insist on nuance, some people feel overwhelmed, not because they oppose nuance, but because their inherited tools were built for survival, not reflection. Now let's slow down even more. Imagine a family where generations ago, someone crossed a line and never crossed back. They passed. They stayed silent. They raised children who never knew. Those children grew up free from certain dangers, but also free from certain truths. They learned who they were allowed to be, not who they might have been. And that shaping didn't end with them. It echoed into parenting styles, into emotional restraint, into an emphasis on respectability, because respectability once meant safety, and safety is hard to unlearn. Now let's gently approach something uncomfortable. Passing didn't just remove people from oppression, it also removed them from solidarity. When someone passed, they often had to distance themselves from Black communities entirely, not out of rejection, out of necessity. Contact was risk. Association was exposure. So separation wasn't ideological, it was logistical. But over time, logistics hardened into identity, and that separation contributed quietly to fragmentation.
Not because people wanted division, but because survival required isolation. Now let's step back again. What we're really talking about is adaptation. Human beings adapt constantly to hostile environments. They change behavior, they change language, they change memory. And once an adaptation works, it becomes tradition, even when the environment changes. So, when people ask why racial tension feels unresolved, the answer isn't just policy, it's adaptation lag. The danger has changed, but the instincts haven't fully caught up. Now let's think about modern discovery. DNA tests, archived documents, digitized census records. People find things their families never told them, and the emotional response is rarely neat. Some feel vindicated, some feel betrayed, some feel embarrassed for feeling anything at all. Because there's no socially agreed upon reaction. And that's because we never built rituals for uncovering silence. We built rituals for celebrating pride, for mourning loss, for honoring struggle, but not for rediscovering what was hidden for survival. So people improvise. They sit with it quietly. They tell one trusted person. They scroll late at night and don't bring it up again, which is exactly how the silence continues. Now let's consider something subtle and important. Not everyone who learns this history feels connected to it emotionally, and that's okay. Distance is also an inheritance. Generations of silence can dull emotional immediacy, and feeling neutral doesn't mean something is wrong. It means the story has traveled far. Now let's come back one more time to the original children. When they were alive, they were navigating immediate danger. They didn't think in terms of legacy. They thought in terms of tomorrow. What do I say? Where do I go? Who sees me? They made choices that allowed life to continue. And life did. Messily, quietly, indirectly. Now let's reflect on something almost poetic. The system that tried to rigidly define race ended up producing generations who lived between definitions. And the system never quite recovered from that. It pretended it had. But pretending takes effort, which is why discussions of race still feel charged, still feel personal, still feel unresolved. Because underneath modern language are very old anxieties. Now let's slow down toward an ending, not a conclusion, just a settling. If you've listened this far, your mind may feel a little floaty. That's intentional. This is not history meant to be gripped tightly. It's history meant to be absorbed passively, like weather, like background sound, because that's how it operates in real life, not as facts you recite, but as assumptions you inherit. Now let's leave you with the quietest realization of all. Most people living today are carrying histories they did not choose, did not author, and did not fully receive. And that doesn't make them dishonest. It makes them human. The children born to enslaved people who looked white didn't solve anything. They didn't fix injustice. They didn't dismantle systems. They simply survived in ways that systems never anticipated. And survival, quiet, adaptive, unremarkable survival, is often the most disruptive force of all. So,
All right, welcome back again. If you're still here, or half here, or just letting this play while sleep slowly negotiates with your thoughts, good. That's exactly where this part belongs. Part 11 lives in the middle, not the beginning, not the aftermath. The long, quiet middle, where nothing dramatic happens, but everything continues anyway. Because most of history, like most lives, is lived there. Let's start with something deceptively simple. After the danger passes, people don't suddenly relax. They adjust. They loosen their grip a little. They stop scanning rooms quite so carefully, but the habits stay close, like furniture you keep even after moving houses. Families shaped by passing didn't wake up one morning and say, "All right, it's safe now, let's be honest." They just exhaled, slowly, over decades. And that slow exhale became the culture of the household. Now, let's sit with that idea. Culture isn't always music, food, or holidays. Sometimes culture is what you don't do. You don't overshare. You don't draw attention. You don't ask people where they're from unless they offer first. And those behaviors don't feel historical. They feel polite. They feel normal. They feel like just how we are. That's how the past hides best. Now let's drift gently into the idea of respectability. Respectability wasn't just a preference, it was armor. For people who could pass, behaving properly wasn't about pride, it was about reducing scrutiny. Dress neatly when they're unfair. Not because rules are moral, but because rule breaking invites attention. And attention was dangerous. So over time, respectability became a value in itself. Parents taught children to behave well without always explaining why. Children learned that being good mattered more than being curious, and curiosity faded. Now let's widen the frame again. Society rewarded this behavior. People who blended in were praised as hardworking, respectable, trustworthy. People who questioned structures were labeled disruptive. So the lesson reinforced itself. Blend in and thrive. Stand out and struggle. Which is why silence often feels safer than truth, even generations later. Now let's slow things down further. Think about family gatherings. Someone mentions ancestry, someone else laughs it off. A third person changes the subject to food. No tension, no argument, just a gentle redirection. And everyone understands the cue. That's not coincidence. That's a practiced choreography passed down without instruction. Now let's talk about emotional inheritance. Trauma doesn't only pass through fear, it also passes through caution. Children learn what makes adults uneasy long before they know why. They sense it in tone, in pacing, in silence. So they grow into adults who avoid certain edges without knowing what's over them. And that avoidance can look like calm. It can look like maturity. It can look like emotional stability. But underneath, it's often just a well-maintained perimeter. Now let's gently approach something complex. Not everyone who passed felt guilt. Not everyone felt loss. Some felt relief. Deep, uncomplicated relief. And that matters too. Survival doesn't always come with sadness. Sometimes it comes with gratitude. And judging that from a distance misses the reality of what was at stake. People didn't pass to make statements, they passed to live. And living, quietly, uneventfully, unremarkably, was the victory. Now let's float over to the children of those children. By this point, the story is even thinner. They inherit habits without origin stories. They feel impulses without explanations. They might feel strongly about fairness, or deeply uncomfortable with conflict, or drawn to stability above all else. And they assume it's just personality, which is partly true. Personality shaped by history. Now let's talk about why this still matters even when no one remembers the details. Because systems are made of people, and people act based on instincts. When large numbers of people share similar instincts, avoidance, caution, deference, those instincts shape institutions. They influence what gets challenged, what gets accepted, what gets delayed indefinitely. So history doesn't need to be remembered to be effective, it just needs to be embodied.
Now let's gently consider modern frustration. People today often ask why conversations about race feel circular, why progress feels slow, why misunderstandings repeat. One reason is that we're often debating outcomes while carrying unexamined instincts. We argue policy with bodies trained for silence. We discuss justice with habits built for survival. And those don't always align. Now let's slow the pace even more. If you're listening to this late at night, your mind might be drifting in and out. Thoughts connecting loosely, images fading before they fully form. That's appropriate, because this history doesn't demand sharp focus. It operates like a low hum, present, persistent, easy to ignore until you notice it's gone. Now let's return, briefly, softly, to the original children again. Imagine them not as historical figures, but as ordinary people growing older. They had routines, preferences, annoyances. They worried about money, about health, about whether their children would be okay. They weren't symbols to themselves. They were just tired people navigating complicated lives. And that ordinariness is important, because it reminds us that history is mostly made by people trying to get through the day. Not heroes, not villains, just survivors. Now let's gently land this part. There's no revelation waiting at the end of this story, no final lesson to underline, just an understanding that some histories don't end, they diffuse. They spread out until they're part of the air. And when you breathe that air long enough, you stop noticing it's there. Until someone, somewhere, starts talking quietly about it again. And even then, not loudly, just enough to remind you it's there. So, if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. You don't need to remember every word. You don't need to hold on to every idea. This story doesn't require effort. It will keep going whether you're listening or not. That's how the long middle works. History breathing softly, life continuing anyway. Good night.
All right. Welcome back. Yes, we're still moving. Slowly. Gently. Like history pacing around a dark room, not quite ready to sit down. If Part 7 felt like the story had quietly turned its chair toward the present, Part 8 is where it settles into the room with us. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, just there. Because by now, this is no longer a story about past children, past laws, or past silences. It's about how those silences became background noise, and how background noise is the hardest thing to notice. Let's start with something small. Think about how often people say, "We just don't know much about that side of the family." It sounds neutral, harmless, even normal. But historically, not knowing was rarely accidental. For families shaped by passing, forgetting was active, intentional, necessary. Names were dropped, places were avoided, photographs were never labeled, stories were shortened until they lost context, and eventually the absence itself felt ordinary, like static you don't notice until it stops. Now let's widen this idea just a little. Entire communities learned how not to know. White neighborhoods absorbed families who fit visually. Schools welcomed children who blended in. Churches accepted congregants who didn't raise questions. And nobody asked where they came from. Not because curiosity didn't exist, but because curiosity threatened comfort. And comfort is powerful. So the system didn't collapse under ambiguity. It adapted. It learned to coexist with contradiction as long as the contradiction stayed quiet. Now let's talk about generational distance. When the original danger fades, the reason for silence fades with it, but the habit remains. Children inherit rules without explanations. Don't ask, don't say, don't correct. And those rules become emotional reflexes. People feel discomfort without knowing why, defensiveness without a clear trigger, a vague sense that certain conversations are risky, which can look like denial from the outside, or avoidance, or indifference, but often it's just inherited caution. Now let's think about how this shaped public narratives. For a long time, slavery was discussed as a system that happened over there, on plantations, in fields, at a distance, but the existence of white-looking enslaved children complicated that story. It implied intimacy, domesticity, family-level entanglement, which made the story harder to tell cleanly. So it was softened, abstracted. Slavery became economics, politics, regional conflict, not bedrooms, not children, not inheritance disputes over people who looked like family. And because of that, modern audiences often feel surprised when confronted with these stories, not because they're rare, but because they were edited out. Now let's talk about why that editing still matters. When a society avoids acknowledging how deeply intertwined its hierarchies were, it struggles to understand why inequality persists. People ask, why does this still matter? Why can't we just move on? But you can't move on from something that was never fully integrated into the story. Unprocessed history doesn't disappear. It becomes structure. Now let's gently return to the idea of identity again. For descendants of passing, identity can feel oddly provisional, like something that works but could be questioned, something that fits but not perfectly. And that feeling doesn't always express itself as racial anxiety. Sometimes it shows up as overachievement, or people-pleasing, or a need to belong very convincingly, because historically, belonging was conditional, and conditions linger. Now let's step into the present moment more fully. We live in a time obsessed with visibility, with telling stories, with uncovering hidden histories, which is good, necessary. But it can also clash with families whose survival depended on being unseen. So, when people hesitate to engage, it's easy to misinterpret that hesitation as resistance. But sometimes it's just unfamiliarity with openness, a muscle that was never safe to use. Now let's talk about reconciliation, but quietly. Reconciliation is often imagined as confession followed by relief, but for families shaped by passing, confession can feel destabilizing, because it doesn't just reveal facts, it rearranges relationships. It changes how people see themselves and how they're seen. And that kind of change doesn't happen cleanly. It happens slowly, awkwardly, with long pauses, which is why many families sit in a middle space, aware enough to suspect, not ready enough to ask, and that limbo can last generations. Now let's widen the lens again. This phenomenon of people existing between categories and forcing systems to adapt did not end with slavery. It repeats with immigrants, with class, with language, with gender. Every time a system claims clarity, reality introduces blur, and the response is always the same. Rules tighten, definitions sharpen, enforcement increases, until eventually the system has to acknowledge that blur is permanent, and then it pretends it always knew. Now let's circle back to the original children one last time, but differently, not as historical subjects, as teachers, not because they intended to teach anything, but because their lives demonstrate something quietly important, that identity is negotiated, not discovered, that belonging is granted, not inherent, and that systems survive by pretending flexibility is fairness, and survival often requires compromise that looks confusing in hindsight. Now let's slow the pace even more. If you're listening to this late at night, half asleep, there's something appropriate about that. Because these histories don't announce themselves, they seep in. Through family habits, through discomfort, through things that feel personal, but aren't. And noticing them doesn't require confrontation, just attention. Now let's gently address the idea of responsibility. Understanding this history doesn't assign blame, it assigns context. It explains why certain conversations feel charged, why certain topics feel exhausting, why some people react strongly to ambiguity, because ambiguity once carried stakes, and memory doesn't always distinguish between past and present danger. Now let's drift toward a soft landing. If Part 8 feels like it's saying less while meaning more, that's intentional. By now, the facts are in. The events have happened. The patterns are clear. What remains is atmosphere, the feeling of living inside inherited structures you didn't build. And that feeling is subtle. It's background noise, which brings us to the quietest conclusion yet. History doesn't only live in dates and documents. It lives in reflexes, in silences, in what feels normal. And the children born to enslaved people who looked white didn't just expose a system's contradictions. They helped create a world where contradiction could be ignored as long as it behaved. And we are still living inside that arrangement. So, if you're drifting now, thoughts blurring, words softening, that's okay. This story was never meant to end sharply. It fades, like background noise you only notice when it's gone. Good night.
All right. Hey, welcome back. Or welcome again. Or maybe this has just been playing, quietly, while your mind drifted in and out, picking up sentences the way you pick up sounds in a half-remembered dream. That's fine. That's actually perfect, because Part 14 isn't here to introduce anything new. It isn't here to explain. It isn't even here to teach. It's here to sit. By now, this history isn't something you're following. It's something you're sharing space with. And that's exactly where it belongs. Let's begin with a gentle truth that doesn't feel dramatic enough to be called a revelation. Most of the past doesn't feel like the past. It feels like habit. It feels like preference. It feels like just the way things are. That's how the history of passing finally completed its work, not by being remembered, but by becoming ordinary. Families stopped thinking of silence as protection. They started thinking of it as politeness. They stopped thinking of restraint as survival. They started thinking of it as maturity. And once something becomes maturity, no one questions it. Now let's slow down and stay there. Maturity is often praised as emotional control, as calm, as being reasonable. But sometimes maturity is simply well-trained caution. The ability to swallow reactions, to smooth over discomfort, to let things go without asking why they bothered you in the first place. And for people shaped by generations of conditional belonging, that ability was essential. It kept life predictable, and predictability meant safety. Now let's widen the frame just a little. Imagine entire communities where predictability became the highest value, where success meant not attracting attention, where achievement was quiet, where ambition was respectable, but only within limits. Not because people lacked talent, but because visibility carried risk long before anyone alive could remember why. So restraint passed for wisdom. Now let's drift into something almost unnoticeable. Tone. Tone is one of the most enduring carriers of history. Not words, not facts. Tone. The calm tone when discussing difficult topics. The dismissive tone when someone asks too many questions.
the light tone used to deflect discomfort. Children absorb tone like weather. They learn what kind of curiosity feels welcome, what kind feels inconvenient, what kind feels dangerous, and they don't need explanations. They just adjust. Now let's slow this down even more. Imagine a child growing up hearing family stories. Some are detailed, some are vague. Some start confidently and then trail off. The child learns which stories are complete and which ones aren't. They don't push. They sense that incompleteness has a purpose, and eventually they stop noticing it. Now let's widen the lens again. Societies do this too. They tell some histories in full, others in outline, others only in academic language. And the history of white-looking enslaved children ended up in that last category, documented, analyzed, but rarely felt collectively. Because feeling it requires acknowledging intimacy, proximity, entanglement, and that's uncomfortable, so distance was maintained. Now let's gently approach the idea of distance. Distance doesn't always mean denial. Sometimes it means containment. People keep things at arm's length because they don't know where to put them emotionally. This history doesn't fit neatly into pride or shame. It exists in between, and in between is an uncomfortable place to rest. So people step around it. Now let's pause on something important. None of this required conspiracy, no secret meetings, no coordinated forgetting. It happened organically. People learned what made life smoother. They repeated it. Their children inherited it. That's how most history operates, quietly, incrementally, without announcement. Now let's return, again gently, to the original children. Not as symbols, not as lessons, as people who grew older. People who aged into routines. They woke up. They worked. They worried about ordinary things. They were not thinking about the future implications of their choices. They were thinking about survival, about stability, about whether tomorrow would look like today. And when tomorrow did look like today, that was success. Now let's sit with that. Success doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like sameness. And sameness repeated long enough becomes tradition. Now let's talk about tradition. Tradition is often framed as deliberate, chosen, honored. But many traditions begin as coping mechanisms. They exist because they worked once, and then they stay because no one questions them later. The silence around ancestry, the discomfort with ambiguity, the preference for neat narratives. These were not philosophical stances, they were practical ones. Now let's slow the pace even more. At this point in the story, there's nothing left to uncover. No new archive, no hidden letter, no missing record. Everything that needed to happen has already happened. What remains is texture, the way the past feels when it brushes up against the present. Now let's talk about feeling. Feelings don't always arrive with names. They show up as hesitation, as overthinking, as a subtle pull towards safety. They show up as discomfort when someone insists on clarity, because clarity was once dangerous. Now let's widen the lens one final time. Modern society likes boldness, visibility, declaration, but not everyone was shaped for that. Some people were shaped for endurance, and endurance doesn't announce itself. It just keeps going. Now let's slow everything down. If you're listening to this in bed, your body may already be heavy, breathing slower, thoughts less linear. That's good. This part isn't meant to be held on to. It's meant to dissolve, because this history dissolved into everyday life long ago. Now let's gently approach rest. There's no takeaway here, no instruction, no expectation you do anything differently tomorrow.
Awareness doesn't always require action. Sometimes it just asks for space. Space to exist without judgment, without urgency, without resolution. Now let's sit with the quietest truth of all. The children born to enslaved people who looked white didn't just reveal the instability of racial categories. They revealed something more enduring, that human systems are held together by habit, that survival shapes behavior long after danger fades, and that the most lasting histories are the ones people stop noticing. And noticing them doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be gentle. Like this. So, if your eyes are closed now, keep them closed. If your thoughts are drifting, let them drift. This story isn't going anywhere. It has all the time in the world. Good night.
All right, welcome back again. If you're still here, or half here, or just letting this play while sleep slowly negotiates with your thoughts, good. That's exactly where this part belongs. Part 11 lives in the middle, not the beginning, not the aftermath, the long, quiet middle where nothing dramatic happens, but everything continues anyway. Because most of history, like most lives, is lived there. Let's start with something deceptively simple. After the danger passes, people don't suddenly relax. They adjust. They loosen their grip a little. They stop scanning rooms quite so carefully, but the habits stay close, like furniture you keep even after moving houses. Families shaped by passing didn't wake up one morning and say, "All right, it's safe now, let's be honest." They just exhaled, slowly, over decades. And that slow exhale became the culture of the household. Now, let's sit with that idea. Culture isn't always music, food, or holidays. Sometimes culture is what you don't do. You don't overshare. You don't draw attention. You don't ask people where they're from unless they offer first. And those behaviors don't feel historical. They feel polite. They feel normal. They feel like just how we are. That's how the past hides best. Now let's drift gently into the idea of respectability. Respectability wasn't just a preference, it was armor. For people who could pass, behaving properly wasn't about pride, it was about reducing scrutiny. Dress neatly when they're unfair. Not because rules are moral, but because rule breaking invites attention. And attention was dangerous. So over time, respectability became a value in itself. Parents taught children to behave well without always explaining why. Children learned that being good mattered more than being curious, and curiosity faded. Now let's widen the frame again. Society rewarded this behavior. People who blended in were praised as hardworking, respectable, trustworthy. People who questioned structures were labeled disruptive. So the lesson reinforced itself. Blend in and thrive. Stand out and struggle. Which is why silence often feels safer than truth, even generations later. Now let's slow things down further. Think about family gatherings. Someone mentions ancestry, someone else laughs it off. A third person changes the subject to food. No tension, no argument, just a gentle redirection. And everyone understands the cue. That's not coincidence. That's a practiced choreography passed down without instruction. Now let's talk about emotional inheritance. Trauma doesn't only pass through fear, it also passes through caution. Children learn what makes adults uneasy long before they know why. They sense it in tone, in pacing, in silence. So they grow into adults who avoid certain edges without knowing what's over them. And that avoidance can look like calm. It can look like maturity. It can look like emotional stability. But underneath, it's often just a well-maintained perimeter. Now let's gently approach something complex. Not everyone who passed felt guilt. Not everyone felt loss. Some felt relief. Deep, uncomplicated relief. And that matters too.
Survival doesn't always come with sadness. Sometimes it comes with gratitude. And judging that from a distance misses the reality of what was at stake. People didn't pass to make statements, they passed to live. And living, quietly, uneventfully, unremarkably, was the victory. Now let's float over to the children of those children. By this point, the story is even thinner. They inherit habits without origin stories. They feel impulses without explanations. They might feel strongly about fairness, or deeply uncomfortable with conflict, or drawn to stability above all else. And they assume it's just personality, which is partly true. Personality shaped by history. Now let's talk about why this still matters even when no one remembers the details. Because systems are made of people, and people act based on instincts. When large numbers of people share similar instincts, avoidance, caution, deference, those instincts shape institutions. They influence what gets challenged, what gets accepted, what gets delayed indefinitely. So history doesn't need to be remembered to be effective, it just needs to be embodied. Now let's gently consider modern frustration. People today often ask why conversations about race feel circular, why progress feels slow, why misunderstandings repeat. One reason is that we're often debating outcomes while carrying unexamined instincts. We argue policy with bodies trained for silence. We discuss justice with habits built for survival. And those don't always align. Now let's slow the pace even more. If you're listening to this late at night, your mind might be drifting in and out. Thoughts connecting loosely, images fading before they fully form. That's appropriate, because this history doesn't demand sharp focus. It operates like a low hum, present, persistent, easy to ignore until you notice it's gone. Now let's return, briefly, softly, to the original children again. Imagine them not as historical figures, but as ordinary people growing older. They had routines, preferences, annoyances. They worried about money, about health, about whether their children would be okay. They weren't symbols to themselves. They were just tired people navigating complicated lives. And that ordinariness is important, because it reminds us that history is mostly made by people trying to get through the day. Not heroes, not villains, just survivors. Now let's gently land this part. There's no revelation waiting at the end of this story, no final lesson to underline, just an understanding that some histories don't end, they diffuse. They spread out until they're part of the air. And when you breathe that air long enough, you stop noticing it's there. Until someone, somewhere, starts talking quietly about it again. And even then, not loudly, just enough to remind you it's there. So, if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. You don't need to remember every word. You don't need to hold on to every idea. This story doesn't require effort. It will keep going whether you're listening or not. That's how the long middle works. History breathing softly, life continuing anyway. Good night.